this webinar on spiritual abuse, a webinar organized by the Union of European Conferences of Major Superiors. Um, just a few words. My name is Jules Labens, currently the president of UTRISM, and I'm a member of the Order of Pious Schools, founded by St. Joseph Calasanzi, and I come from Hungary. And today I will be the speaker of this webinar. It is a great honor because you've been participating into this event. There are a lot of people. There's more than 370 people connected on Zoom, a very high number, I'd say. And at the beginning of this webinar, I should like to welcome Patrizia Morgante and all the collaborators of UISG, i.e. the International Union of Superior Generals, who've graciously helped us to organize such an event. So thank you very much for this cooperation. And now, before entering into the dynamic of this webinar, I should like to invite all of you into a moment of prayer. So let's observe a few minutes of silence to put ourselves in the presence of the Lord, of God. And we ask him to bless this webinar and this being together of us.
Nostro Padre, che hai creato il mondo.
Our Father, you created the world and you created it for us. So we should like to thank you for our life, for your call and our vocation. You've created all of us for full life, for us to be able to grow and find the sense of life, and for us to give our lives for the kingdom of God and for the others. We should like to give thanks to you, our Lord Jesus Christ, who were risen from the dead. You came for us to have life and to have it in abundance, and you've shown us the path of life. And we should like to invoke you on us, Holy Spirit, for you to pour on us your presence, your light. We should like to ask you to guide us during this day, for this webinar, for this meeting, to be helpful to the life of others, brothers and sisters, and for our own life. Thank you. Amen. And before listening to the speakers, let me just spend a few words on the choice of today's topic. 1 year ago, well, before the pandemic and before the outbreak of such a pandemic, UTRISM celebrated its General Assembly in Rockenburg in Germany. We were thinking about together, the president and the representatives of national conferences thought about common topics, and these topics drew our attention, amongst which there was the topic of spiritual abuse, and the number of people who registered for today's event let us understand that this is a very important topic for today's religious life. It's a very important topic. Why? Because it goes to the very heart of religious life. And it has to do with being respectful of people's freedom and being respectful of the human person and their integrity and growth. And it has to do with our way of living within the community. It has to do with our way of exercising the power within communities. And it has to do with the very important field of formation of our congregations and orders. So, talking about spiritual abuse also means to think about our way of living the religious life, to think about our way of conceiving man and his integral growth and development. And this carries with it a number of repercussions, of consequences. First, we would like to be more sensitive, more compassionate with the suffering and the sorrow of people who've been victims of some forms of violence and spiritual abuse. It carries with it the intention of trying forms and structures that should be more suitable for protecting the people within our communities. And so I think that today we are talking about a central topic of our religious life. Now, the topic of spiritual abuse is a sensitive issue, and all of us who are here connected, we are sensitive to this topic for um, some reasons. It touches us, it is of interest to us. And so let me add one important thing on how to listen to today's speakers, how to be present and to live out today's webinar. It is possible that topics like spiritual abuse may evoke the so-called triggers, traumatic triggers, triggers of sorrowful trauma that we have undergone in the past. I should like to encourage you to feel free if you feel that it's not good for you to listen to the reports, get out of the webinar and get back to the safety of your present day. You may talk to a brother, a sister, a spiritual director. If you don't know who to address, you can write an address to the address what you got registered for the webinar, and we'll try and help you to find somebody who may be of help to you personally. Speaking with this a great number of participants, we cannot give therapies or accompaniment right now, but we'll be helping you to find someone who may help you. And before starting off today's work, let me explain in a few words how we are getting organized for this morning's meeting. The webinar consists of two similar parts. First, we're going to listen to a speaker, and then we're going to meet up in the breakout rooms in separate groups to talk about this and listen to one another. Then we get back to the plenary to answer the questions that have been raised during the parallel streams, and we're going to listen to the answers of the speaker. And there will be two blocks organized like that this morning. The first speaker is Sister Katharina Kluitman, and I would like to introduce her later on. And then the second speaker will be by, speech will be by Dr. Doris Reisinger. And at 11 o'clock, there will be quite some time for a break. It's always good to know when we are supposed to have a break before starting off the work. Now, before the parallel streams, the parallel groups, I'm going to provide you with a few indications on the methodology to be used. And this said, I should like to introduce the first speaker of this webinar, Sister Katharina Kluitman. She studied theology and psychology in Bonn and the Gregorian University here in Rome. The empirical research for the PhD was focused on the situation of women's religious life currently in Germany. And the title was The Last One sheds light. Caterina Kluitman worked in pastoral care, both in parishes and in vocational pastoral care, and as a psychologist for priests, religious men and women, and in the period 2004-2018, she worked in Münster. She's a Franciscan sister of the Penance and the Christian Charity. Now she's provincial of her province in Germany. And she's currently the president of the German Conference of Major Superiors. And she was elected back in 2018. And within the conference, they've worked hard over the last few years on sexual abuse, but also on spiritual abuse. Dear Caterina, thank you very much for having accepted our invitation to be today's speaker. And I'm very curious about your report, so I should like to hand over to you now. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. What you're supposed to do now is a short introduction on the topic of spiritual abuse. What can you expect now? 3 preliminary notes, 4 main aspects of the topic, and 5 concluding notes. 3, 4, and 5. Let's start off immediately. Preliminary note number 1. What is spiritual abuse? There is not yet a precise definition that everyone can agree upon. For the moment, for the time being, I propose a working definition like that. Spiritual abuse is a collective term, or as we say in the Anglo-Saxon world, an umbrella term for various forms, covering various forms of emotional and or power abuse in the context of spiritual and religious life, especially in forms of accompaniment, confession, spiritual direction, and so on and so forth, and in communities. A final definition is not yet foreseeable, but it also applies to sexual abuse, although the latter is much better studied. In general, in psychology, there are often these marginal blurs. The discourse on spiritual abuse began in the United States in the more evangelical, charismatic sphere, where what we call parishes are indeed smaller communities. Today, I will speak mainly on the topic of spiritual abuse in the context of Catholic religious life, i.e., new movements or traditional communities, orders, congregations, secular institutes, and so on and so forth. But however, accompaniment is included by way of analogy in this. Preliminary note number 2. One can discuss whether spiritual abuse is the right word. Not an easy discussion in an international context with so many translations. One can also think about the term religious abuse as an alternative. One can ask whether the word abuse is not too reminiscent of sexual abuse. With this terminology, the vocabulary of a perpetrator and victim, survivor is also easily brought into the discussion. In Germany, where there's talk of sexualized violence, quote unquote, there's also talk of quote unquote spiritualized violence, in order to make it clear that abuse is never spiritual in the stricter sense of the word, but that Spirituality is used for purposes unrelated to spirituality, and that it is violence. Violence. Spiritualized violence, as the Germans say. The Pope Francis, sometimes calls the phenomenon abuse of conscience. One can argue about issues of terms, but more important than arguing about words is to address the issue itself, even though it is easier to argue about words than to address reality. Preliminary note number 3. After the definition and after questioning about the word, the term, preliminary note number 3, there is an intersection between spiritual abuse and sexual abuse. When boundaries are violated in one area, the inhibition to do so in another area may diminish. But of course, there is sexual abuse without spiritual abuse. An example, the father sexually abusing his daughter in an atheist family. And there's spiritual abuse without sexual abuse, all the things that we talk about today that can happen without sexual acts and feelings. Spiritual abuse does not become bad only when it leads to sexual abuse, although unfortunately at present, it can often be read that way. Spiritual abuse is inherently horrible. Indeed, it can lead to suicide. However, I believe that the fundamentals, the basic socio-psychological dynamics, the basic psychological structures are similar in both forms of abuse. It is always an abuse of power. Let's start off with the main part. Since there's usually not much time for the topic of spiritual abuse, I was looking for a very simple image that would make the topic vivid. So the crosshair in a rifle came to my mind, this one here you see on the screen. Abused people end up as targets in the crosshair. You see the image. For ease of translation, I do not give you a diagram, but show you the picture with my arms. Aspect number 1. The first characteristic of spiritual abuse is the violation of boundaries. It is perhaps the first thing that comes to our mind. The violation of spiritual boundaries violates the privacy of the person. The person loses the protective space that their dignity deserves. This is where the most intimate things of the spiritual life take place. In the communities, this takes frighteningly often the form that the accompaniment is only offered or even allowed within the community, not without. Here, the areas of forum internum and the forum externum become confused, which in canon law are strictly separated. The leadership takes over the accompaniment, or those who accompany pass on to the leadership what they've heard in pastor care. Especially in the new and still small congregations, incestuous structures develop very easily according to the model: A priest accompanies B, B accompanies C, C accompanies D, and everyone goes to confession with A, who is perhaps also in the leadership. It sometimes happens that superiors call an external spiritual director and say that they know brother X or sister Y is accompanied by him. Don't let yourself be drawn into such a trap. Leaders who find that they get nowhere, she restarts the sentence, leaders who find that they get nowhere with these techniques eventually abandon their attempts. So they give up their attempts. The seal of confession can be violated in a specific way that clearly contradicts canon law, i.e., the seal of confession also applies to the person confessing. I did not understand the meaning of this until I started studying spiritual abuse. How easy it is for a confessor who encounters the person not only in confession to more or less veiledly pressure them with the weaknesses he knows from confession. Similarly, this also applies to the processes of accompaniment. In this context, obedience becomes an instrument of power and domination. Let's move on to aspect number 2. Apparently, contrary to this, there are also very strict boundaries in systems of spiritual abuse. Boundaries to the outside world. They limit man and his freedom with prohibitions of contact. These can be manifest, clearly stated, but they can also be conveyed more subtly through nuances and raised eyebrows. These contact prohibitions have to do with other people who do not belong to the community. Maybe an exception is allowed towards people who have to be conquered, quote unquote, for their own project, but only for this purpose. The narrow boundary applies not only to individual persons, but also to other institutions and groups. The cooperation of one's own group with other groups or communities is not sought, not desired, not even within the church. Not infrequently, prohibitions of thought are added, clear canons of what is permitted to be read and what is not. Whoever believes that the spiritual life can be lived today with only the catechism or the works of the founder is mistaken. In such a community, seminars, courses, workshops, and retreats are only offered internally. Everything else is suspect, or at least judged and condemned as not conforming to the charism. In some communities, this closes the access to the spiritual treasure of knowledge and experience of the sound tradition of the church. And you will hear more on this later on by Doris Reisinger. Between the violation of boundaries and the prohibition of contact, there is a space of lack of freedom, what Irving Goffman calls the total institution, and which is often quoted together with Robert Lifton's thoughts on brainstorming, brainwashing, or thought control. There's much that could be expanded upon here. I will just read you the list of criteria for total institutions. You will already recognize much of what I've just said. More follows in aspects 3 and 4. There's control of the milieu, controlled relations with the outside world. There's confession, wrong use of confession, of course. There's what Lifton calls mystical manipulation. The group has higher goals than the rest of the world. There's self-sanctification through purity, pushing the individual to strive for unattainable perfection. There's an aura of a sacred signs. The beliefs of the group are sacrosanct and perfect. Overloaded language, new meanings for words to promote black and white thinking. And we'll hear more about this. There's a doctrine on the person, stating that the group is more important than the individual. And there's the so-called spared existence. Those who are are saved. Those from the external world are destined to destruction. So there's talk as to the extent to which the models just mentioned can be applied to sects, to cults. And we're also moving in that direction here, be it on the surface, so orthodox. The structures of communities with spiritual abuse are similar to those of a sect of cult. And if you look a little closer, this also applies to the teachings and theories, the doctrine, which often seems so Catholic at first sight, but at least the Catholic e both and is overlooked. A word about this dynamic. It does not work at all only behind the walls of a monastery. Isolation from the world can be implicitly imposed by structures. Those who, and I'm not exaggerating, those who are prescribed an hour of oral prayer every day, attendance at the Holy Mass, an hour of adoration and missionary work every weekend, in addition to a normal job, simply no longer have time to meet people outside the community and to think about other things. Just look at the profession formula in a community which states, I promise to devote all my time to prayer and the apostolate. This is not humanly possible. In these first two aspects, we are in the more psychological, sociological field. Aspect number 3. If we consider what underlies the tension just described, we come to the dimension of depth psychology, the most individual one. Why? Because there's on the one hand a certain exaltation, more psychologically expressed, an idealization. The community is presented as elitist. From here will finally come to the church the hoped for salvation. How dangerous this is in times when the church is truly in need of salvation. How seductive, even for church leaders. The exaltation starts with the leadership. It is perfect, enlightened by God, more or less directly, therefore unassailable. Anyone who has a problem is turned into a problem. I repeat, anyone who has a problem and states and says that he has a problem is turned into a problem. You are the problem. Often, the leadership itself, in the sense of the second aspect, is not very familiar with the spiritual tradition of the church. To experienced and informed Christians, some things then seem rather simplified. The practice of the congregation participates in this idealization, the idealization of the leader, the founder. One's own practice is presented as the only right one. Even doctrine seems to be the only perfect one. That and only that is the way to salvation, the way that surely leads to heaven. This dynamic is often narcissistic. From a weak sense of the self that sees itself in black, sees itself bad, follows an attempt to save self-esteem through exaltation. More on this in a moment. Aspect number 4. Aspect 4 must necessarily follow from this, from idealization. He who idealizes devalues others. It's all too logical. In a system of spiritual abuse, man does not count. His needs are bad and must be cut off, suppressed, or deleted. Perception, especially the perception of one's own feelings, is cut off, disavowed, confused. What I would say most serious Christians consider a great achievement, the discovery of the individual, of individuality, is blatantly neglected here. By way of illustration, by way of example, try to think of, let alone experience, Ignatius of Loyola's discernment of spirits without perception of one's own emotions. It doesn't work. This devaluation gets the phase of humiliation, which then corresponds to exaltation in the third aspect that we've mentioned. Failure is not expected in such a system. There's no right to failure there. But this is inhuman because it ignores the on-the-way character of the Christian faith, which is a message of permanent conversion. Between idealization and humiliation, a space of constant frustration opens up because perfection, which must be achieved at all costs, can never be attained. Because who would be flawless? What is missing in this model are shades of gray. Here, there's only black and white. But this is precisely the dynamic of idealization and devaluation. They almost always occur together. Splitting is what psychology calls this, splitting. It is considered one of the most immature defense mechanisms. Splitting is a process that happens in borderline syndrome, but also in narcissism. The person who, for biographical reasons, experience themselves as inwardly black and bad, puts on a shiny silver shell, exalts himself and degrades others if they do not adore him or her. Tragically, this silver shell is made of Teflon and therefore almost impossible to get into. Thus, the supposed blackness cannot be discovered and therefore cannot be redeemed. It is true, the Church lives by high ideals, but by themselves they do not make life possible. It needs the other pole, reality, with its feelings and needs. The Jesuit Luigi Maria Rulla, founder of the Institute of Psychology at the Gregorian University, sees in a successful tension between ideal and reality the most forgotten basic tension of life. It is like a guitar string. It is like a guitar string. If it is not tight, of course, it does not give any sound. But if it is too tight, if the ideal is overemphasized, then the string breaks, goes pling once, and no longer makes a sound. If you now consider that it is precisely perception that is clouded in these forms of spiritual abuse, you are very close to the basic dynamic of spiritual abuse. Let us now turn to the connections of the various aspects. In this crossroads of boundary violation and limitation, of devaluation and idealization, alleged superiority is used to justify violations of privacy. This is at the same time interpreted as a help for the condemned person who is held back in his weakness. You're so weak that I have to enter inside you. External contacts seem unnecessary because the perfect community offers everything one needs. Finally, the negative image of man offers the justification that contact bans would protect people. And this creates a crosshair that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. So this becomes a net that is increasingly difficult to escape. At the same time, there are signs, so to speak, warning lights, in which she starts again. At the same time, there are signs, so to speak, warning lights in which the opportunities for help are contained. Aspect 1. Many of the rules in the communities that violate the boundaries violate canon law. Warning light. This is where conscientious reading of the statutes, especially when they are presented for approval, can save people and vocations. Even the more subtle forms that are not written down must be measured against canon law, even if this is more difficult, of course. It is the task of the Church, of the magisterium, to watch over such developments. As long as the magisterium reserves the right to approvals, it also has the duty to use these procedures for the good of people. In this, the spiritual tradition is clear. See the last canon in canon law, which states that everything is for the salvation of souls. Aspect number 2. Confinement and isolation in such structures can be seen in the fact that no experts are brought in, and precisely in that would be a help. Not all kinds of experts are needed at the same time, of course, but without experts, the members are deprived of important resources. Aspect number 3, idealization. Idealization becomes particularly clear when dealing with the abandonments. People who leave the community. They can often provide important help and contribute with their perceptions. Those who forbid members to have contact with the ex-members, former members, are probably dangerous. Aspect number 4, humiliation. Humiliation is shown by frequent breakdowns of members. Some things just cannot be done because it is impossible to succeed. Strengthening these people helps to upset and weaken the system and, at best, heal it. And this is where the concluding remarks begin. Concluding remark number 1, possible aid. What can be done? The first thing is to become aware as an affected person, but also as someone who observes such developments, those who accompany people in such a dynamic. It is therefore important that those accompanying have their own accompaniment and, if possible, supervision, collegial supervision, whatever you want to call these forms of reflection. It is important to train the inner senses and encourage people to trust their own perception again. Then follows the step of talking within the community and beyond. If all else fails, one has to turn to church authority. But even that can be partial. If necessary, one must keep oneself and/or others safe. The important thing after leaving of such a group, of such community, is to learn that certain negative feelings are completely normal. One has because it was a total institution covering all areas of life, one has lost almost all areas of life. And this takes time, and one can only start again very gently. As they say in the English-speaking world, it is easier to get out of a cult than to get the cult out of you. Concluding remark number 2, group dynamics. This idealism, which is good and normal in itself, needs the counterbalance of sobriety, of sound doctrine and tradition. Personally, as a novice, if I flew away idealistically, my Prussian teacher would bring me back to the carpet. In a new community that is being formed and only has the strength to do so if it is full of ideals, young members, perhaps newly converted or newly called, meet newly converted, newly called leaders in a highly charged community structure. It is then easy for this to build up to a level that is unhealthy for each other. I see it as a measure of danger if a new community is willing to be challenged or not, both from within and from without. Even our old religious orders, now simple, sometimes bourgeois, often had these initial phases. Even the great saints, think of Francis or Ignatius, were often excessive in their asceticism in the beginning. Even the church itself had to learn a lot in the beginning. And after 2000 years, it is still not finished. It is still learning. This leads immediately to concluding note number 3, perpetrators. Unlike sexual abuse, not all spiritual abuse has a malicious intent. Not all spiritual abuse have a malicious intent. Above all, perpetrators of spiritual abuse are not necessarily and always so. However, they do gain out of spiritual abuse. Most often, it is in power and in control, entirely in narcissistic logic. In any case, such an abusive dynamic is temporarily anxiety-provoking, but simply not effective, so that the anxiety comes back through the back door. Worse, for both perpetrators and victims, the more unconscious it is, the more dangerous it is. Concluding remark number 4. There are 5 of them, so which means that we are about to conclude. The victims. Victims of such groups are often young members with little experience. Their idealism is exploited. They do not know how to distinguish between the difficulties required by the gospel and what is a self-constructed narrowness that does not serve life. In this context, young people are both those who are young in years and those who are newcomers in the faith. Also vulnerable are those who are fragmented, either because they've never been able to build a stable structure, or because they are currently in a difficult stage, in a difficult phase of their life. Personal strength is the best protection. If personal strength is lacking, The tight structure of a community, which takes my mind off things, is tempting at first. Also, initially, it is a relief when I can escape the inner pain of fragmentation through external rituals. And unfortunately, another group of people is at risk, which partly overlaps with the groups just mentioned. People who have always lived in abusive systems are particularly at risk because there's the psychological truth, initially surprising but ultimately plausible, that people prefer what they know to what may be better but alien. There's the so-called central emotional position in which we've settled and which we find infinitely difficult to leave, even if one lives badly. So those who are already accustomed to abusive structures may try to escape them, but they often end up in a very similar community dynamic. Concluding remark number 5, in the accompaniment. Although I have now spoken mainly about communities, these dynamics apply very similarly to the processes of accompaniment, with the only difference that there the escape is often easier. There, the one who accompanies is exalted and the one who is accompanied is devalued. On the one hand, boundaries are not respected, the privacy of the person is not respected also in the spiritual sphere. And on the other hand, the stricter demarcations are made, for example, not to talk to other people, not to change the accompanying person. The subject, the topic of spiritual abuse is not new, although the word is new. There are texts about this in the tradition. Saint Ignatius, Teresa d'Avila, John of the Cross, but perhaps it is also true that our sensitivity today is greater. It has probably grown as a result of the reflection on sexual abuse. And much of what we've learned there can be applied to the dynamics in the community and also to the dynamics within the church as such. We hope to use what we have learned for the good of all, especially for the good of the victims, men and women, and to prevent other people from falling prey to dangerous groups. I should like to thank you for your kind attention.
Tante grazie, cara Caterina, per
Thank you very much, dear Caterina, for this dense, very well structured speech with very clear points, so 1, 2, 3, 3, 4, 5, with the clear concepts about the psychological dynamics that you have shared with us and that are at work in these contacts within this framework of spiritual abuse. I should like to thank you very much. And this is not lip service. And let's move on to another dynamic. We've listened to Sister Caterina's speech. Now I should like to invite you to do the group works. And before entering the groups, I should like to share with you a few items, a few points. Now, the framework of group work. These groups are language group, so they're going to be created according to the languages that you have mentioned when you registered, and according to the language that you have indicated before your name when you renamed you on Zoom, and the people are going to be distributed in groups automatically. So you do not have to choose, you just have to accept the invitation that is being sent to you. And the number of participants in group will be more or less 10, 12 people, no more than 12. In order to make the most of this group work, there will be roles. So there are two roles to be identified within the group. One is the animator, the facilitator. Every group needs a facilitator to distribute the time in order to leave everybody to take the floor. And so people should have enough time to take the floor and share. And another role, there's a need of a person collecting questions that are going to be raised in the group. So this person is going to collect the questions that are raised and puts them in a Google Doc. So before starting the work within the groups, you should have two people accepting to play these two roles. What is the method for you to follow in the group? So the group will meet 25 minutes. It's not a long period of time, but we think that's enough. But there's not enough time for long personal presentations. So you just say your name, your congregation, and the country you come from, the country you are connected from. And then we should like to invite you to share personal reflections. How has the topic just presented touched me? What was most interesting? What was surprising to me? What I didn't understand? What is the question I have to enter into more in-depth analysis, etc. Now, a few personal reflections that you may have had in you during this presentation. And we should like to invite you to listen to one another and then to establish a dialogue. The ultimate goal of the group is not to create questions, but if questions emerge, the person who accepted to collect questions should put these questions in the Google document. After the group work, we'll be having another dynamic. So these questions are going to be raised for Sister Caterina, and she will answer the questions. But you should not make an effort in order to raise questions. If they emerge, they're going to be collected. What happens with the questions, if any? After this presentation, I'm going to send you a link on the chat room of Zoom. Please open the link. And when you enter your group, this link, this Google Doc, should only be used by the person that collects, that gathers questions. So this is the document you will have if you click on the link. And then you have to choose the language. And so you have the number of your group, and you may put your question in this grid. So you fill in the grid with your questions, then these questions are going to be collected by people who've been chosen. Sister Marjolina Brunnen for Italian, Margaret Mays for English, Robertunus for French, Sister Francisca Bruckner for German, and Sister Ramona Gabarro for Spanish. So they're going to collect together the questions, and they're going to select two questions for each language. So there will be 10 questions that are then going to be asked to the speaker, Sister Caterina. This means that not all questions will have an answer, will get to the speaker for an answer. But I think that it's the easiest way to get organized for this part of our work. So I wish you good job. I stop sharing my screen. And now
voglio aprire questo documento Google per...
So I'm trying to open this Google Doc
condividere con voi il link.
to share with you the link in your own language. Now, of course, the number of groups is no longer important, but you have lines and you can write the questions in those lines. So we give ourselves quite some time. And then I'm inviting the 5 people in charge with the different languages. During this time of personal reflection, you can follow the questions that are raised. So in the end, I ask you to choose 2 questions among those raised in your language. Okay? Are you okay with this? B plan? Hope I was clear. So this is our B plan. So if you open this Google Doc, you can write your questions, if any. Hope that the Google Doc can run for can run for at least 50 people.
Sì, too much traffic, forse è difficile. Sì. Sì.
Or maybe it's difficult.
Facciamo semplicemente così, che qualcuno che ha una domanda perché
For those who may have a question, they can write in the chat. In the chat, you can write it, but I don't know why you can't write on the document. Well, the idea being
possano scrivere tutti. Sì. Sì. E abbiamo aperto per tutte, però pare che
we open to everybody, but it seems that very well.
ho inviato di nuovo il link.
I've sent you I've sent you the link again. Maybe it's working better now.
Caterina, sarà così che io
Caterina,
chiamo
I'm going to call the first person for Italian. And this person is going to ask 2 questions, then over to English, 2 questions. You take notes. And then you can follow the order you like to answer the questions, okay? Until what time they can write, because they're writing a lot. There will be, you have to set the time and you have to say stop, because it's difficult to choose 2 out of the many questions that we are receiving on the chat. I think that we can give ourselves another 5 minutes.
Try again the groups. To try again. No?
Penso che adesso già no.
No, ok.
No.
Okay.
Per la prossima,
Ok.
per il prossimo blocco.
Not
Okay.
now, we'll try for the next block.
Thank you, Florence. Arrivano delle domande.
We're receiving many questions, quite many of them.
Ok. Allora, penso che già abbiamo
Well, I think we already have enough questions.
Dobbiamo avere un po' di tempo per le
So we need to
persone
have
che
a
poi
few
scelgono
people
le domande perché possano leggere
for the
tutte
people
le
are
domande che
choosing the
contengono
questions because
la
they have
la loro lingua.
to take their
Per
time to
questo
read
vi
all the
chiedo
questions in
di
their
non
relevant
continuare
language. So
con
please
le
stop
domande, lasciamo
asking questions in the chat.
lavorare le persone responsabili per le lingue.
Let's
Vi
leave
chiedo di
the
non scrivere più
responsible of every language
niente
to
nel documento. Le 5
use.
persone,
So the 5 people, Margaret,
Francisca,
Robert,
e Ramona,
Francisca, and Ramona, please
selezionare
select 2
domande
languages.
e poi alle 10:30
And then at 10:30,
continueremo con le domande.
we resume
Così queste 5
to ask the
persone
questions to the
possono
speaker.
lavorare. Grazie per
So
loro.
let's leave the 5
Gli
people
altri possono,
work for another 8 minutes,
alzarsi,
and the others can have a
un
stretch out
caffè
break
e torniamo
or have a
alle
coffee.
10:30
So we get back at
in questo blocco
10:30.
e
So
continueremo
you have
con
7
il
minutes
quiz.
available before the Q&A session. Thank you.
Bene. sceglierne altre.
Yeah. Bene.
Ok, allora, prima le domande in italiano. Marjolaine, ti chiedo di presentare
Let's
le due.
start with the questions in Italian. Marjolaine, for the two questions. There are questions
Per la relazione di Suor
that are easy
Caterina,
to be answered.
trovabile nel nostro sito web.
Can we find
E anche, parlando dei
Sister
voti
Caterina's
religiosi,
speech on our website?
parlate
And then
nel prossimo
about
webinar.
religious
Ma
vows,
adesso dove
this
sta
will
la
be
relazione
the topic of the next
Ma
webinar.
sono le domande che ho scelto io.
These are the questions I've chosen. First,
Esistono? Ok. Adesso non posso più leggere. Ecco. Esistono anche abusi spirituali personali non legati a un
there's
sistema,
also personal
dove
spiritual
l'autorità
abuse not linked
abusa
to a system where the
dei
authority abuses
spiritualizzando.
of
In tempo di
her
lockdown,
power
o
by
per
spiritualizing
esempio,
during
persone
the lockdown
fragili o
or
anziane
in case of
abusate.
fragile
Cioè,
people
più facile.
or sick
Come
people. This
creare
is easier.
condizioni
How to create
favorevoli a questo,
unfavorable
cioè
conditions for this,
la
how to
tutela
strengthen the
dell'espressione
protection
della volontà
and the
individuale,
expression of
la
individual
possibilità di scelta.
willingness, the
Questa è
possibility
la
of
prima
choosing, of
domanda.
choice.
Caterina prende
First question, I don't know whether Caterina can answer
o si può forse
right now,
Prendo
or
le note e poi
I'm taking
rispondo a
notes
tutto insieme.
and then I'm going to answer.
di questo posso
Um,
Sì, sì.
Have you already taken note of this? Can I move on to the second question? Yes, you can.
Chi si trova in ruoli di autorità maggiore,
Those who are in roles of major authority
può riuscire
at
a
superior level,
comprendere
not community
se nelle
level, how can they
comunità
understand
o
whether
queste forme di
communities there are these forms of
si può
spiritual abuse,
intervenire
and how
per
can they
salvaguardare
step in to
il
safeguard
personale,
the personal
spirituale,
well-being,
persone
spiritual and psychological well-being
abusate e
of
abusanti.
all abusers and the abused. I should like to invite Sister Margaret Mace to ask the questions, the two questions in English.
Okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear
Yeah.
me? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
What do I do when I find out about a situation of abuse that has been going on for over 20 years? The person left the community, has told me about it, and I know that nothing is being done. What do I do now that I know? Second, the image of the guitar string. Who determines if the structure is too tight and abusive? What might be too tight for some might be just right for others. So how do we determine what is too tight and abusive? And along with that, how does a formator determine whether or not there is abuse on the part of an outside person, such as a confessor?
Grazie Margaret. Adesso invito
Thank you, Margaret. And now I should like to invite Father Robert Tunus to ask the questions in French.
Oui, donc première question.
So a first question
has to do with the accompanying person. Is there a way of avoiding spiritual abuse? And in which way can an accompanying person become aware of committing a spiritual abuse? Second question, which has to do more with the victim. How can we help a victim to overcome an abuse, and which will be the role of the community? Because the victim doesn't necessarily have to leave the community, but at the same time, the victim needs to be protected, and certainly the community has to play an important role. So the question is actually, how can the victim be supported, and which is the role of the community?
Thank you very much, Robert. Now I should like to invite Sister Franziska to ask the questions in German.
Now the questions from the German group.
Eine der wichtigsten Fragen, die ich wahrgenommen habe, war, braucht es eine angemessene Form der Machtausübung in der Leitung und wie
So, does it need an appropriate form of using power in leadership?
Was bedeutet in diesem Zusammenhang im Bereich geistlicher Missbrauch der Gehorsam als Gelübde?
And what does obedience mean in this context?
Als Missbrauch interpretiert werden kann. Wie schaut da das Verhältnis aus?
And how is the relationship between obedience and spiritual abuse? Can we eliminate that one?
Grazie. E invito adesso Sor Ramona
Thank you
Gabarro
very much. Over to Sister Ramona for questions in Spanish.
Sí. Hay una pregunta sobre
There's a question about the victims. It says, what can be the key questions to be asked to a person to identify that this person is being a victim of abuse? What elements need to be expressed to understand that it's not just a perception, rather an actual abuse? And there are other questions about authority, and one says, what is the limit or the responsibility of the abuser, especially when he or she says that this is being done with good consciousness? Thank you.
Tante grazie.
So thank you very much. Well, Caterina, we've received quite some questions for you. And we have some 20 to 22 minutes for your answers. So over to you.
Sono solo io a sentire un rumore?
Am I the only one who has a noise?
Bene. Allora, abbiamo una settimana a rispondere alle domande?
So it would take a week to answer all these questions. Unfortunately, we don't have 1 week, but what we hear in the questions is that we have to understand what is the function I play for the victims. On the side of victims, what is most important is for victims to have the possibility of understanding what is happening. If a person is in the situation, this person tends to think for a long period of time, well, it's all right. I want this. I'm okay. I want this. And others say, but there's something wrong with all this. But the victim says, this is what I want. This is holiness. This has to do with sanctity. So I've seen many people, when they see the criteria that I've mentioned in my speech, and this person say, this is what is happening to me. Okay. And they start thinking about them. They start perceiving something wrong. And then they try to find help. There may be methods. Teresa of Avila says how to try and find help, but even this is not allowed. What can I do if I'm the person accompanying a victim? Is to give her strength, to reinforce, to give force to her. Okay, this is what you feel. And what else? What are your feelings? So continue to probe into the feelings of the person to make the person stronger. Now, the role of the community depends on whether the community itself is an abusive community, or whether the community can help to solve an abuse perpetrated, for example, by a confessor coming from the external world in the community. But what is most important is that you have to start by believing the person, believe what they say. So first, believe them. There may be limits. I know. People asked to do something in obedience and they do not feel like doing it. And so they end up by saying, this is spiritual abuse. And Doris Reisinger will give us a very clear example in her report, in her speech. Here in this context, where almost everybody, all of you are superiors, major superiors, I'd say, if the person herself says, I do not want to abuse anybody, this is one of the best signs. If you do not want to abuse people, this is a very positive sign. And I'd say that every person accompanying, every formator, every superior of communities or major superior, all those who are in leadership, rendering this leadership service, must have a sort of supervision and others to share with. How are you doing? How are you organizing things? I saw this once. We chatted on spiritual abuse. Oh, you, Katerina, you do something on this issue. And we were chatting amongst all people doing a spiritual direction. And at a given point, a priest said, but in case, this means that sometimes I'm doing something that is not good. Can I share this with you? And we've helped this priest. He realized, he was very experienced, but he realized that there was something wrong in what he was doing in that case. This is very important because all of us, we have blind points. This is very important. So we need to set criteria. We need to have criteria available, and we need to understand the perception, what happens inside me. So we have to have a reflection, and what would be equally very important would be to think about the theological level, to do reflection on a theological level. But this is very weak. There will be a second workshop on May the 18th, and this will be one of the themes that will be addressed, but it is still difficult. In Germany, we held a workshop on the spirituality of vows after the crisis of abuse. We have some ideas, a few ideas from different viewpoints, this point of view, that point of view, but there's not yet something refined, well refined and finalized, not yet. We have to refine this. There's another question of a person that has lived 20 years in an abusive community. What can be done? Well, it is difficult to say, but so one question, what to do for the victim? The victim should be helped to try and find a treatment, a therapy, sometimes financial help for this person to be able to continue to live. And the other question is, what can I do against the community? What can I do to help the community? The problem being that if a community for a 20-year period has started with an abusive system and has perpetrated that over a 20-year period, this won't be stopped for the simple reason that somebody comes and says, this is not good. It will last longer. In Germany, now we have, and this is written on newspapers and magazines, so there's no secret about that. We are having cases where there's visitation, the bishop doing visitations in communities to try and to understand what is happening in these communities. The question about boundaries. Where does spiritual abuse start? Well, it's already difficult when we talk about sexual abuse. There are clear-cut cases when you can say this is abusive, this is spiritual abuse, but also in sexual abuse, there may be cases where it is said, well, this is the culture of the place, this can be done, this cannot be done. So it's difficult. In spiritual abuse, it is even more difficult because there's sometimes there's nothing material, nothing concrete, pragmatic. But Jolt's criterion, he mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, when he said that God wants life and wants us to live it abundantly. This is a very good criterion. If life is diminished, if life is constrained, if the person becomes shyer and shyer, if the person becomes more and more anxious, this is not good. This may not be spiritual abuse, but this is not good for the person. If a person starts growing up and becomes more and more joyful, more and more cheerful, more and more happy, happier and happier, this means that she's really happy. So I'd say that this may not be abuse. This does not mean that a person should always be smiling, permanent smiling. I don't think that Jesus was smiling on a cross, not at all. It's not being always smiling, but a sort of sense of peace, of vitality. You can feel the vitality of the person. I think that this person is not abused if she pours on vitality on people around her. And there's a problem that remains, even if the person herself, and if there's somebody accompanying her who understands what is going on. Well, this does not mean that the other people will accept. The perpetrator may not accept this, and if he does, it's not a serious case. Not that the case is not that serious if the perpetrator accepts and changes. And I'd say that within the church, bishops and so on and so forth are not always able to and do not have enough competences to deal with the spiritual abuse. As a German person and as a member of the synodality that we have been living, I'd say that the question of power and the way power is being managed also within the church as such. This is a big issue, and this is an unresolved issue, a huge issue that remains unresolved. And in such an atmosphere, it is very difficult to try and solve the issue within religious communities. There's a gap between what we think about individuality and personal freedom and what we are accustomed to believe in. And the question is, where does gospel lie with all this? Where is tradition in the good sense of the word? A life-giving tradition, tradition with the big T, capital T, and where are small T traditions that ends up by becoming constraints. Hope I was able to answer all the questions that were raised. I'd say yes. And there can be 2 or 3 more questions, if any. Thank you very much, Caterina, for the answers. Maybe you've seen questions in the chat that may have drawn your attention, or we can listen to the different groups. One question I really liked, because I don't have any answers to this. There's a question that I didn't understand all too well. It seems to me that was put in French. I don't speak French, but more or less I understood that the question is whether we have a gospel narration showing us how spiritual abuse works and where we can find a solution to it. I have to think about it because I can't think of a narration in the gospel about spiritual abuse. An example might be the Syrophoenician woman to whom Jesus says, I cannot help you because you're not one of my people. And she says, but even dogs will have something falling from the table of the people on the ground, from the table of the master on the ground. But in Germany, there's Klaus Mertes. She has this very good biblical idea. So it's not about gospel, but biblical. He is a good example on how to deal with spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse confuses the person accompanying, the superior, ends up by confusing these persons with God. And this is what happens with Samuel. Samuel believes that Ellie's voice is God's voice, or God's voice is Ellie's voice. And Ellie says, this is not my voice. This is a very good example against the spiritual abuse. Ellie knows that is not God, but God is God and remains God. And the person has to enter in a relationship with God and not in relationship, in this case, with Ellie, with him. And these strikes a sound balance, because God is God, and the person accompanying or the confessor or the formator and the superior are not God. Another question? Well, we have quite some time for another question.
Scegli tu, Caterina?
You're going to choose one, Caterina?
Sì, vedo che ho dimenticato
I see that I forgot one aspect. I talked about the group dynamic in the newly born young groups. But of course, it is possible to see spiritual abuse also with people who are weak because they are aged or they're sick. There's a principle, the principle of 4 eyes. It is good if people do not act alone. If in a community there are many aged members, as is the case of European communities, it is important to have not just one person to take care of aged sisters or brothers. So there should be at least 2 to have 4 eyes, even more than 2 people taking care. And there should be a culture of care, of attention, for one to say to the other, oh, my sister, I see you doing like that. I wonder whether this is good or not. So it's collegial supervision within the community. We hold so-called prevention workshops against sexual abuse, but this can help also in case of spiritual abuse to have a relationship. Because we have to accept that one can be mistaken. So I say, well, yes, you're right. I've never thought that I was wrong. Very common but simple example. I've never thought that maybe this can be violating the privacy of one of my sisters if I knock on the door, on her door, and I entered the room of an aged sister without knocking on the door. If I know that she can no longer say, come in, but I have to knock on the door all the same. This is a sign to mean that I don't want to invade your realm. It's little things. If a sister says, Caterina, how can do like that? I've heard that the sister is not very happy about you behaving that way. I can think about it. And if we're able to create an atmosphere where people can be mistaken, but we also know that the others dare to tell us that we are mistaken and that we are doing mistakes. I think that this is a great help. This is very helpful. And I think that this culture of accepting, of welcoming, of attention, this would be This would be the ultimate goal to be achieved. This is not all, so this is not an exhaustive answer, but this is what I can say for the time being. So, dear Katharina, thank you very much for your speech and also for answering the questions. We have received so many questions, and all of them are interesting in the chat room and also in the Google Doc. All these questions, of course, we're going to collect them and they will be kept in our archives. This will be a great help to continue our work in the future. Now, let's have a 15-minute break. I'd like to ask you not to disconnect. So remain connected on Zoom. So please remain in the Zoom. Cut off your mics, your cam, because this will be helpful to organize the breakout rooms in the second group. So if we get out of the meeting, it will be very difficult for you to be assigned to a breakout room. So 15-minute break, a little bit of fresh air, and we see you at 11:15, and we're going to continue. We'll be handing over to Dr. Doris Reisinger. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask the people who have not renamed themselves, putting the language to do so during the break. You all have to rename yourselves, and before your name, include the language